Thank you very much. Good afternoon. People, I'm from Zimbabwe. Make me feel comfortable by welcoming me. Where is the hospitality that I hear from the Kenyans?
Good afternoon.
All right, thank you. I know you love Mugabe, so at least we can see some similarities. So help me to quickly welcome here Francis, Charles, and Monica, who are part of the panel. So while they are coming, I'm going to briefly introduce them. I know they'll share something about themselves also quickly, but I start with Monica. So I had to Google your name, Monica. So it means to advise. So what basically we would want is to pick your brains when it comes to artisanal small-scale mining. How do we fight illicit financial flows? How do we make sure that the people that are at the core, that are driving the mining sector, directly benefiting from it, are not prejudiced? So this is basically what we would want to hear from you, because normally when we talk about mining, the sector is forgotten. People like to talk about big contracts, big investors, and forgot that and usually miss out. Then Freeman, Warrior, that's Charles for you. And I know that we are going to get ideas that are not boxed. So we would want to hear from you. Francis, I hear that you are frank. So we just want that quick, incisive analysis. So the objective of this session, number one, the principal one, is to discuss trending issues on tax and natural resource governance in Africa, but we are going to narrow down the conversation to Kenya, but it does not stop us to talk about other country experiences where necessary. The specific objectives, one, to discuss emerging pressure points and opportunities on tax and natural resource governance at country level here for Kenya. Number two, to strengthen common positions, sharing and learning from country and sub-regional and regional experiences on emerging issues natural resource governance. Then the last one is to reinvigorate advocacy work on strengthening natural resource sector, tax linkages, and upscaling the agenda of curbing illicit financial flows. I don't know who shared my WhatsApp number with the participants here, because I've got 32 messages saying it take a lot of time. So I'm not going to respond, but let me make sure that I give the opportunity first to Monica. Yeah, feel free to compress three things. One, what are the current experiences are like, what is needed going forward, so that we change the game when it comes to make sure that people benefit from artisanal small-scale mining. Thank you.
Monica, do you want to present for this one or?
I don't know for optics. I think she will love the television. Yeah. Please come here.
Yeah. For the online. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Morning.
Yeah. Thank you, Mukasuri, for this opportunity. Very quickly, let me just start by saying that unlike the oil and gas sector that Charles, of course, is going to talk about, there's a dualism in the mining sector, where there's the large-scale players, the LSM, and the small-scale and artisanal sector, the ASM. So I'm not sure there's ASM in oil and gas, but for sure there's ASM in mining. Focus has always been, when you talk about, I like what the terminology was used, decolonization of the sector, because the sector and the focus is always, when you talk about mining and oil and gas, is a big boys game. There's a lot of capital, so focus is always on what is the Western country coming to do in Africa. And we forget, even if you look at the mining licenses in Kenya, easily over 70% are actually owned by Kenyans, local players, right? Just focus this conversation when we talk about illicit financial flows. What we see for artisanal and small-scale miners is informality that is breeding illegality in the trade, okay? I was discussing during lunch break with someone, and I said, before we revised the mining law in Kenya, artisanal activity was actually illegal. And in most African countries, they're looking at their mining codes because they realized as long as you make artisanal miners to be illegal, that's where a lot of the problems begin, because artisanal activity is a livelihood activity. As the gentleman has said, I think from Igori, when you say you're an artisanal miner, people need to eat, they need to feed their children. So these are investors of circumstances, not opportunities, right? So for the artisan miners, I don't think they deliberately want to be illegal. They do not want to do anything wrong, but you must make compliance to be as easy as possible. Don't make laws that are onerous for people to be able to become legal. And that's what the Mining Act of 2016 in Kenya sought to do, and said, one, if they're illegal, we cannot interact with them. If they're illegal, we cannot interact with them. So let us first make them legal, and let's know who they are. And by legalizing them, it means they can get permits. Unfortunately, as it's been pointed out by the lady from Transparency International, right? The information has not sufficiently been passed on to these artisanal miners. It has also not become very easy for them to seek these licenses, because structure, if you go to Migori, Kakamega, Taita, how many of them have that internet to be able to apply for a permit through the cadastre system? How many of them have the knowledge to be able to interact with the cadastre system? So you have legalized them, but you have also made that legalization not accessible to the people you want to assist, right? So there's work to be done there. We made them legal. How do we make it easy for them to get information on how to be legal? How do we make it easy for them to access and interact with the cadastre system? How do we cascade this information to where they are and make it easy for them to join the system? And when we talk about that, I cannot forget to talk about gender issues as well. Women are always marginalized further. So in addition to helping artisanal miner, how do we also help the women who are artisans to be able to interact with that system, right? So Mukasiri, the one thing that I think is happening in artisanal mining activities, and we've seen many countries doing this, is trying to formalize artisans. But unfortunately, most countries end at, as long as we can give them permits and licenses, they walk away. You know, and that's what I think I was very interested in understanding. What is the role of the state? What else do you do to these artisanal miners? Because artisanal mining is more of a social activity. You know, there's the youth, there's the women in there. You cannot say, we'll give you permits, and now that you have a permit, the next thing I want from you is tax. That is not possible. By who these people are, you cannot legalize them with incentive in order to tax them. It will not work, you know. There has to be other mechanisms that are put in place to help structure artisanal miners, you know. So you've given them permits. How are they going to access the land that they're mining in legally? How do they access that land? And once they access that land, how do they get the capital to be able to do the mining? And once they get that capital, where are they going to get the markets where they're going to sell that commodity in a fairly priced manner, in a transparent manner, where now the government can, over time, educate them and teach them and say, with a permit, with capital, with this setup, you are now legalized and formalized in such a manner that you should now pay a certain amount of tax for this activity. So it's a whole process, and from experience and what I've seen from both the miners of gold and gemstones, especially for the miners of gemstones who I interact with in most countries, not only in Kenya, the issue of at what point are we paying the state, and what has the government done for me? I am contending in the bush where I have not seen any infrastructure or any support by anyone. But the minute I get something I need to trade, you tell me there's a 16% VAT for trading. So what am I paying for? And for what am I paying for? Is, you know, artisans cannot answer this. So let us not legalize and formalize miners in order for them to pay taxes. Let us first legalize them and set them up in such a manner that they interact formally with the system, start to realize the benefit of this economic activity. Then along the way, let's find out how we can add them to become taxpayers in that equation. When we talk about artisanal miners facilitating these illicit financial flows, this has been mapped out It is true, and especially even in gemstones, at least for gold, it is bought a lot locally because it is used by local players. So if you're in Migori, and they will attest the players in Migori, you can trade off your gold in Migori. But for items like gemstones, consumption of gemstones is not for domestic. Most of the people, if I have a sapphire or I have a diamond, most artisanal miners are not preoccupied with wearing a diamond worth 250,000 shillings. They want to feed their children, they want to go to school. So by nature, that gemstone must cross the border to go to where it is most valued. And that's where the problems begin. You know, this is not something you'll detect. One little stone is worth millions of shillings, right? So the initiatives we're working on right now in the gemstone sector is to promote responsible sourcing of gemstones, where we are also telling the source markets, for sustainability of your supply chains, you need to come back and work with source countries. You know, the question where people are saying, we have miners who don't look like what they mine. A miner who's mining gold but is in abject poverty. A miner who's mining sapphires but is in abject poverty doesn't look like what they're mining. All stakeholders must come together and talk about responsible sourcing, where the markets also must want to share in the prosperity of the source of these minerals. And that's a conversation we're discussing now in the gemstone sector. And luckily, there's been an awareness and a sort of woke consumers who are now asking the right question: who mined my gold? Who mined my sapphires? Who mine my gemstones? And with this kind of awareness, it's bringing back attention to the source markets, where people want to do more for the miner, and they want the story behind that mineral. So do not smuggle from your source countries and bring it to us. We want you to be able to, we want to pay you fairly for the minerals that you have extracted, pay your taxes, so that even I, as I own your mineral as a consumer, I can tell the story. I can carry the story of the source market. So this is a new way of thinking where it will ingrain sustainability, because people are more conscious about, they want to do it for the good of the people, the miners, they want to do it for the good of the environment, you know, and also for profit. It is business, and this model will breed sustainability in the supply chain of these minerals. So of course, any new way of thinking and any new way of doing business will always be fought. Old players in the supply chain are not very focused on this, because for them, information asymmetry is what has made people become rich in this trade. Where if I buy gold from somebody who is not very preoccupied on the value, or if I buy gemstones from somebody who doesn't know the value, it means my margins are higher. So if you're saying we're bringing information back to the miners to correct information asymmetry, there's a bit of resistance from some of the players, but we hope with this new way of doing business, where we're entrenching responsible sourcing, we're talking about transparency, and even in the gemstone supply chain, we're testing blockchain technology to be able to safeguard the provenance of these gemstones and of these minerals, where you can say this gold is mined in Kakamega in Kenya from this mine, and you can trace the supply chain, you know, and also trace who got paid, how much did they get paid, was it documented when it was leaving the country. We're hoping this new way of doing business will also curb the illegality in the supply chain when it concerns artisanal miners, and actually bring more prosperity to the miners and bring more revenues eventually to the governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. So just quickly, you need to dissect the SM sector. Unlike the large-scale mining sector, this is a sector where we are talking about direct or front door way of empowering the people, because they control, they manage the resource. But I'm sure you have heard the risks that are associated with the sector. Can you allow me now to move to Charles, the warrior, the freeman? We want to pick your brains. How do we go about this? What are the experiences in Kenya when it comes to curbing illicit financial flows from the oil, gas sector and the extractive sector general? Thank you.
Check. Yep. So like my name is Charles Wanguru. I work with the Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. I wanted to start first of all by giving sort of an overview in terms of internationally, domestically, and then try and go into how that has an impact on IFFs and domestic resource mobilization. I'll try not to repeat what a lot of people have spoken to earlier today, but the key conversation in the oil and gas sector is around the energy transition. So internationally, and a lot of speakers have spoken to this today, there's a sort of a big shift away from fossil fuel. To realize that also, as we speak about energy transition, speaking of energy transition in the middle of a lot of African countries actually making discoveries in the sector. So I think as recent as last week or the week before, South Africa has made significant discoveries offshore. And so what we're likely to see is that we are going to see a lot more finds. Mozambique, of course, has a discovery for gas, as well as Tanzania. So in that context of the international trend of speaking of energy transition and moving away from fossil fuels, the current context is that we are discovering new resources on the continent, and that has an impact in terms of how we go forward. Even as we speak of that discovery, the current trend is that 84% of world energy comes from fossil fuels. And that's something that's not going to change overnight. We're likely to see sort of 10 to 12 years of demand, and then after that 10 to 12 years is when we're likely to see a sort of a slow decline. So this idea that, we just sort of wake up in a fossil fuel free world, that's not going to happen. And the best illustration at the moment is that even when you look across the room, a lot of the people who are wearing the N95 masks, that's actually an oil product. The N95 mask is actually made off of fossil fuels. So in illustration, I mean, the need and the demand for it still exists even in the current COVID climate. The second conversation is around stranded assets. Because of course, if we're moving away from fossil fuels, so what happens with all these new finds? And so there's a big conversation around stranded assets. And lastly, it's the collapse of the oil price, especially with COVID. So what does that mean for the sector when the international price has gone down? And so how does Kenya, for example, which needs to build a pipeline worth $2 billion US, where is that financing going to come from? Same with Tanzania and the Ugandan pipeline, which needs, again, at least about $1 billion to build a pipeline to get it out. So where does the money come from? But domestically, we also have challenges domestically. And I won't repeat too much. We have a debt challenge in terms of the euro bonds that we've borrowed, a lot of foreign denominated debt that we currently hold. And that is sort of made worse by the fact of the impact of COVID on our economies. So the collapse of tourism, for example, the challenges with horticulture in terms of export has meant that the traditional forex earners for some of our countries are sort of under peril at the moment, which sort of makes it more, it increases incentive to look at other opportunities for forex earning. And so mining and oil and gas, again, become more crucial in that kind of context where we're trying to get as much forex to enable us to service our debts. But so what's the impact of that on the sector? Firstly, very little activity is happening at the moment. And companies are also pushing for a better deal. So in illustration, Kenya had removed some tax incentives around oil and gas exploration as a response to COVID. So sort of the finance ministry looks at the tax incentives that currently exist and had pushed to remove a lot of those incentives to ensure that the country actually increases its collections. But what happens immediately after that? One of the oil companies gave a force majeure notice. So force majeure notice means basically that due to developments, they are unable to continue. And what happened after that? Government had to call in the companies and sort of start renegotiating again around the removal of those incentives. And some of those incentives have been put back, right? So that's one of the challenges actually at the moment in terms of trying to ensure that you're getting more value for the resources. I think Professor Waki had spoken to this, another challenge around negotiation. How do you negotiate for the best deal when you're in a bad position? Because like I said, from the context, We have to service our debts. We need more money. So you're desperate. When you're negotiating from a desperate position, it's very highly unlikely that you'll get a good deal out of that. And then another challenge is sort of the stranded assets question. So when the international conversations around stranded assets, countries feel pressure to try and realize their resources before that window closes. So while I said, for 10 to 12 years, there'll still be significant demand for fossil fuels. When you speak of stranded assets, and I've been in a lot of rooms now where the stranded assets conversation comes up, a lot of countries now become desperate. And it's what Alvin sort of said, for the race to the bottom. So if you're saying there's only sort of 10 to 15 years of fossil fuel use, and you've just discovered gas, or you've just discovered oil, the first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you get your assets to market. And how do you do that? By trying to attract, sort of highest investment, by giving better deals, by giving sort of the tax incentives that we've spoken about. So that's a challenge that exists in terms of being clear about what's the trajectory for fossil fuels, so that when you're negotiating as well, that you're negotiating it from a good position. But if the talk is around stranded assets, then there's sort of this rush to try to develop our resources before that window closes. I want to end on my last point. There's a challenge now in civil society, especially in advocacy. And that's around the two competing conversations. So energy transition, climate change, and sort of resource benefit maximization. Yeah. So a lot of work has been done, for example, and I have to give credit to the tax justice organizations and its network around ensuring countries actually benefit from its resources. But now you have the climate change conversation, and what does that mean for resource-rich countries? And how do you get a common position in civil society when some members are speaking about leaving resources in the ground and others are speaking, how do you maximize the benefits of these resources for the countries, right? So the struggle that exists there is that civil society, again, is dependent on donor funding and donor priorities. So the donor priorities, again, on energy transition and thing, how do you ensure that you as a national level organization, if your focus is on resource benefit maximization, how do you ensure that that conversation is still alive if one of the deliverables is to say, we want to leave the resources in the ground? I want to stop there and sort of welcome some discussion.
I think there are three things that I picked, three words. First, talk about turmoil, oil, and palm oil.
Sorry?
Turmoil, palm oil, and oil. You said turmoil. I said turmoil. Yeah, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's said that you said turmoil, parboil, and oil. Yeah, causing discord. So if something is parboiled, it's half-baked. So you can see from the interventions that are coming in, the rush to exploit the resources with the parboiled frameworks that are there, trying to give tax incentives. So it's something which is half-cooked, right? So it's the danger that Charles highlighted, which can cause indigestion when it comes to development, because you don't have to take half-cooked issues. Then with the turmoil, I'm sure some earlier speakers talk about violence that is associated with the exploitation of oil. Then lastly, the discord among civil society. So Francis, you have heard the two speakers, but you are also from Global Financial Integrity. And you are also frank in terms of your Google name. So please just dissect it quickly in less than 10 minutes.
Siri, Francis Cairo. I am with Global Financial Integrity, or GFI. And before I begin, those who are from Kenya, there's something I learned from Zimbabwe. There's something they call totems. And Sibanda, the totem is a lion. And I think my friend here decided what use is a lion without a mane. That is why he decided to grow grow his hair so that I can become a proper lion. Yeah, I know that we are highly pushed for time, and I will therefore restrict myself to speak to the main issues. And one of the things I want to highlight here is in addition to what my friend who is a tax expert spoke about, how do companies escape tax? And then secondly, how then does government respond? And then I'll look at the issues that we need to think about during our stay here. One is that companies will undervalue the commodity export. That we know very well. Secondly, they will overvalue their marketing costs. They will also overstate their operating costs. They will also misprice services. And that is why we spoke about bringing in experts and how much we declare as having paid them. They will also not declare the byproducts they get. And therefore, that is why we sell just oil. But how many products, how many byproducts do we get from that oil? And do we even tax those byproducts? The other thing that companies will do is indirect transfers of interest. And this is done mostly using complicated corporate structures that will not be existing here in this country. This will be done in another country. And then they will exaggerate the decommissioning costs. And I want you to think about it this way. If they are overvaluing or undervaluing, who holds that information? It is them. If they're exaggerating or overstating, who holds that information? It is them. If you walk to KRA today, into the large taxpayer's office, and ask them for the risk areas they monitor, they will tell you they look at overvaluation of marketing costs. They will tell you they look at undervaluation of commodity export. They will tell you they look at mispriced services. But who is the holder of this information? And how can this information be used to tax if the holder of this information is the person who will be taxed? How can it be done? But then let us look at the other facet. How then does government respond? The Kajiado County government decided to levy 17 billion Kenya shillings land rates on Tata mining because there was no other way of getting Tata. So they decided the easiest thing we can do as the county government is levy land rates. How else does the government respond? Two, is if you look at consumption taxes in Kenya as declared by KRA in 2018-2019, VAT grew by 12%, but customs grew by 8%. Very clearly, when the government cannot get taxes through that other side, they come for our necks through consumption taxes like VAT. And it is also important, I know we are looking at outbound transfers, but it is important to look at the other side when illicit flows come in, inflows. And this has happened. Venezuela, in trying to sell their gold to Dubai, they thought of our friends in Uganda. And they brought in gold into Uganda so that it can be refined and sold onwards to Dubai. Today, Uganda exports more gold than it produces. We looked at the statistics coming from I think it's called the UBA, the equivalent of the central bank. Last year, only 5 kilograms of gold were officially declared as exported out of Uganda. But if you compare with how much gold was received in Dubai, UAE officially, the figures are, it's unimaginable. And therefore, as we look at flows, let us also look at outflows and inflows. For the Ugandan government, it's a good thing because they're saying we have a big market. So I think it's called Anglo Gold refineries. They are some of the biggest taxpayers in Uganda. Is it okay to be taxing this illegal gold in our drive to build domestic taxes? That's a question for us. The other issues I hope we can consider is a lot of the information relating to the large taxpayers or LTOs is held offshore because that is where their companies are. Can government access this information properly for purposes of assessment of tax? When we do transfers, these transfers are done in tax havens. Can we use that information for purposes of assessment? Loan agreements or debt financing, the information contained in those loan agreements, who finances investments locally? It is not local banks, it is external banks. And how do we access that information for purposes of ensuring that whatever LTOs tell us is correct? And capital gains tax, I can tell you for free, it cannot adequately cover the tax for the sale of assets that occur offshore. It can't. And very few African countries today have enough laws actually limiting the amount of debt deductions possible under corporate income tax. These are serious issues. And when these interests that these large taxpayers sell, directly or indirectly, are done through complicated corporate structures, can we, do we have the capacity at KRA, for example, to be able to identify these complicated corporate structures for purposes of assessing tax? And as I finish, I want us to think about other things that are separate from that. One of the things I want us to think about, I know that we are looking at policies that can address illicit financial flows in natural resources. But there are other natural resources that I want us to think about, things like wildlife crime. And wildlife crime, this is why I think it's an important thing to think about in the context of illicit financial flows. If you think about the supply chain of gold, it is the same supply chain for illegal gold. It is the same supply chain for ivory. It is the same supply chain for pangolin scales. And pangolin is now the most trafficked wild animal. And most of them are found in our neighbors here, Uganda. And if you think about that supply chain, it is the same supply chain for mercury that is used in ASGM. And therefore, you're looking at a transnational criminal who is an expert in moving everything, who moves the dollars from our banks here to Uganda and to Congo, where the dollars are needed. The gold is then moved through the same supply chain to Kenya and Uganda, where it can be exported to UAE. The pangolin scales then move into Kenya, where we can use the Mombasa port to export them. And because we need mercury to continue refining gold in the ASGN sector, they use the same existing supply chain. And therefore, as we look at illicit financial flows, it is important to see them from that perspective. The same supply chain is also used to move teak wood from South Sudan. It is used to move sandalwood, and one container of sandalwood is worth about 200 million Kenya shillings. And who are the people that are involved in that? You will find government of Kenya vehicles involved. And therefore, as we look at illicit financial flows, I encourage us to see it in those broad aspects and not to see it in isolation, because all these things are tied. And when government responds, it mostly goes for those that are easy targets. Thank you.
Yeah, I told you the guys is frank. I'm sure you will agree with me. So, three, I think, or 4 quick points. The first one is talking about government getting quarantined when it comes to information access. The information is offshore. So how then do you get to tax fairly without information? So it's not only the public which is starved, we suffer from information poverty, but even our governments suffer from that. The second issue that Francis raised is that he referred to me as a lion, and I was thinking, is there any way we can sue Hollywood for Simba the Lion King, so that at least we get a fair share there? But importantly, you spoke about getting paid fairly, and there is something that I want you to do for two ways. There's paid and charm. Paid, you block the P, you get aid. So what we don't want is to get aid, but to that narrative, let's add a capital letter P, so that we are paid fairly for the exploitation of our resources. You talk about the under-invoicing, prices of our commodities being undermined. Then the other thing we talk about is the decommissioning costs. Look at it, the charm from our resources is blocked by corporates that are greedy. They block the sea. In the end, we get harm. You check it. Thank you.
So, I am looking towards Brian and the technical people, and it's now 4 p.m. and I don't know how much of online comments and questions we have. If you are processing that, we will appreciate. Don't move yet. Don't move yet. Mary is here, and Jared is right there. So Mary and Jared helped us with the Lenny Wanyama to look at the double taxation agreements and the many problems that are there. I didn't hear of many advantages, if any. And then we have come now to the second conversation that was led by Sibanda, where from Monica to Charles, and finally concluding the conversation with Francis, we are talking about taxation and IFFs, and we have heard about the mining sector, the oil and gas, and Francis has brought us home with the various challenges that you can see there. Are there 2 maximum interventions that we want to make in the room on both the double taxation agreements and the taxation and IFFs, so that if they are there, we take those. Let's start with the online ones, and then we can take 1 or 2 interventions here. Direct me to the more specific ones. What are the? So what are the sanction regimes in place in Kenya regarding banks and financial houses that facilitate the movement of IFFs? And what is the implementation status of these sanctions? Who's going to handle that? Leonard will help us with that. Brian, is there another specific one that you want me to? Okay, very good. Now let's come to the house where we are. If there are 1 or 2 prof there wants to say something, Monica, we will come to you. You can make a comment and also ask a question, and then you will be the second, then we'll conclude with Monica. Let's begin with Prof, please. Let's give him a mic. After those 2, Monica and Leonard will intervene. Let's start with Prof, please.
I don't like asking questions, but when I get an opportunity, I do. I prefer to be asked questions, but I'll make a few comments. The first one is about saddlewood and wildlife. I like your candid presentation about how people make money from saddlewood and how people make money from wildlife. But I've been wondering in the privacy of my thoughts why that happens, because that is an issue of regulation and law. If, for example, I was allowed to keep a lion in my place, or an elephant, or a leopard in my house, instead of a goat or a cow, I'm sure the value of these illicit grows would go down, or those illicit flows. So change the law, some of those things will come to an end. Why can't I grow saddlewood? By the way, is it impossible to grow it? Let's go to that. I liked your charity of complicated financial structures. Are you saying that we don't teach those things in our universities for people to understand them? I think you can respond to that. Monica, I loved your technology and blockchains. I'm surprised that artisans can use blockchains. I'm so impressed. I'll go home smiling. Finally, this issue of people not paying taxes, whether you are artisans or wherever you are, eventually everybody pays for it, because this is what's happening. When we avoid paying taxes, whether you're multinationals or artisans, the government lands short of money. So what is the alternative? You borrow. That's why the government is keeping releasing money. So the best thing is for us to start paying taxes so that we don't have the government paying debt. Because we're being selfish. Because we don't pay now for taxes now, then our children will pay for the debts that we borrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's get the mic here. Bring the other one. Yeah. Have we run out of the mics? Thank you. This is the new reality. Yeah. I hope Prof's questions were taken up. Monica, there was, I think he made a comment on technology. He had questions for you, right? For Francisco.
Yes, good afternoon. Osika is my name. I have a question to my colleague, Mary.
Mary.
Yeah, I just, on the issue of the case, do you think maybe it would have been prudent for TJNA to approach the matter by way of a judicial review matter instead of how they approached it by way of a constitutional petition from a litigation perspective?
Yeah.
Because I feel that when the judgment was delivered, once you go through the specific constitutional issues that were being canvassed in the matter, and the submissions by TJNA vis-a-vis it's the burden of proof on those constitutional issues, specifically in the petition, I was of the view that approaching it from a judicial review angle would have been more better to seek these compelling orders against the CS Treasury and all the other parties involved. Having regard to that, the constitutional cases, Anarita Karimi, which deals with the matters that are supposed to be espoused in a constitutional petition. So to me, I feel that it was dismissed because I think maybe of poor draftsmanship, or maybe in a way it contributed to the matter not being really adjudicated as they had wanted.
Thank you. All right, so let's see how we handle this. I want Leonard to be the last one to respond. Let's begin with Mary, and then we go to Monica, Francis, and we see who of the other panelists has something to say, then we conclude with Leonard. Mary, start us off, please.
Okay, so thank you for your question. It's an interesting angle to pursue. I think the issue with the judicial review proceeding is that there has to be unfair administrative action, and passing. I'm not of the personal opinion that ratifying a treaty in a manner that's not necessarily in compliance with the procedures is particularly a procedural well, it is a procedural impropriety, yes, but at the same time, I don't necessarily feel like it is unfair administrative action, because if you look at it, they're free to adopt, to ratify a treaty, and they were within their rights to ratify the treaty. Yes, certain provisions weren't complied with, but for me, it doesn't meet the standard of an unfair administrative action, because then the question itself is ratifying a treaty administrative action in the first place? And then I think for me, the concern would have been, if it was up to me, I would have pursued the angle of interrogating the question of the principles of public finance, especially when it comes to questions of equity, when passing public finance legislation. And it's a new area. It has been approached in certain cases. I think there's a case of Pevans, and it's a tricky one because the courts tend to shy away from the question of equity, but I think it would have been ripe for exploration, and that's my take on it.
So the petition route they took was the correct way?
Because ultimately they are seeking to have the treaty making process. They didn't seek to nullify it, but they want it to be ratified. In the press that they saw in the petition. So it's, if you look at it from a draftsman's perspective, they are actually approbating and reprobating at the same time, because you cannot seek to have a treaty that you want it to be ratified, but at the same time they say it is prejudicial because the process was not followed. There was no public participation. Now, look, if you look at the arguments advanced by KRA, is that they don't have that mandate to involve the public in that process. So how then do you seek to have a treaty that you're saying the procedure was not followed in terms of public participation? How do you seek to have it ratified under the relevant section under the treaty, that act that deals with the treaties? Yeah, so I look at it from...
Yeah. I get your point, and I have heard Mary's response very clearly. I just posed to Mary, in terms of the question he asked, that instead of going to court with a petition, they should have gone in for judicial review. Your position is that the petition way was the correct way. It's on.
In my take is that the petition was a better approach.
A better approach.
I think it's. I think the petition way was a better approach. I think, however, it was a new area. It's an area that's not been tested before. And ultimately, even the way the matter was decided shied away from addressing the core issues. I don't necessarily think the way the matter was brought to court was the issue. I think it could be one of two things, and I have to be politically correct here. My take is that with jurisprudence on tax matters, it is difficult for judges to understand, number one. It's not an area that is often litigated as frequently as other areas, so say contract tort and so on and so forth. So for judges, it tends to be quite easy to make, I'd say a logical argument rather than a technically sound argument.
In this case.
Yeah,
okay.
And that's my take. I don't necessarily think the way the matter was brought to court was the issue. I think that the understanding of
the issues
was what was the problem, and that tends to happen quite frequently with a lot of tax cases.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Mary, and very excellent interventions. I want us to go to Monica very briefly and Francis. I'm skipping Charles because we are having him in the last session, and we would prefer that Charles helps us in the final session as well by making certain interventions. Monica, please.
Thank you. Actually, my intervention was a question to my previous panel on what they're discussing. And I'll give it as a, I don't know how many of you remember the Macquarie law, where he asked that all mining companies cede 35% of local equity, to increase local participation and encourage more local ownership by these large mining companies. And at that point, we were also looking at the mining law, and a lot of things came up, and I'm shocked by the amount of knowledge in this room, because when we were querying how to go and work around what we faced, I wish this is the knowledge and the Kenyans who sat at the table with the government and the Chamber of Mines to offer the sort of ideas they're bringing now, because at some point we were almost being sued for being a banana republic because of asking for 35% local equities for mining companies. And at that point, we came to terms with some of the terminologies I'm hearing today. We had companies that talked about the country where they come from. They have an international investment agreement with Kenya.
With Kenya.
And then that company is registered in Mauritius, and the Mauritius company is the one that owns the Kenyan entity. And now that company has a double taxation agreement. Another terminology came up. And then that company at that point is when we're looking at the mining law, and they're contending about, why don't you give us a mining investment agreement? Now, all these three documents give them some fiscal allowances. All these three documents give them some way of dodging requirements, like, what percentage must be local component, when can you touch, and they kept on telling us, you're going to apply the law retrogressively because we're already existing in your country. And they were citing all these things we keep signing as why we're going to be taken to court. And I remember the other gentleman who presented, and he said one of the recourses, countries implementing minimum standards. These are three different things we're giving one mining company. And remember, before that company gets a mining license, it has already set up. They're not coming to ask for a license, then they go set up. They already come having all these things ready when they're asking for the mining license. So my question is surely to you, Jared, yes?
Yes, Jared.
At what point do we get everybody to sit on the table? Because negotiation happens with a registered company. You asking for them to go to parliament, that is at the end stage when we've already discussed mineral agreements and they're being ratified by parliament. So that's also the wrong stage. When we get everybody, when is the right time to get them on there? Can you put a requirement before you register? This is the minimum requirements of the country of how you register to get a mining license, right? And then how do we build capacity? Like what Dr. Iraki has asked. How do we build capacity? This is civil society talking in the room with so much capacity. How do we tell government this same knowledge of, we have a lot of issues of the fiscal regime at the State Department, looking at where do they tax? What are the pre-tax arrangements by these companies before they come to interact with the mining law? Because they'll interact with Kenya Investment Authority first. They'll interact with KRA before they come to interact with the mining law. So some of those fiscal incentives have been given prior to them coming to the State Department. How do we use all this knowledge to advise government, advise people like the Chamber of Mines in the setup, to be able to avoid some of these issues? And then finally, to finish off on what was my presentation and what Dr. Iraki has asked, yes, we're trying to test blockchain technology on artisanal miners because that's the only way we'll safeguard provenance of minerals from artisans to carry the story of where these minerals come from. Because it's by telling the story of the countries where the minerals come from that we ensure the value goes back to the countries, the source countries. So two things, provenance of those minerals, and the second thing is value addition of those minerals at source. If you add value of your minerals at source, you get more benefits from those minerals. Then ensure they don't lose the identity of what was the source country of those minerals. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Francis. Very briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Prof, for that question. I will answer it by giving a short story of what I saw once. I walked into a room and somebody had told us that he would take us on a trip. And he walked us into a room that was full of lawyers. We are talking about 40 or 50 lawyers with their laptops in front and on phone. And they were setting up companies on behalf of one of the biggest global companies. And their business was to set up at least 3 companies and open bank accounts for those companies and move the profits. So in a day, you move the profits of the main subsidiary 3 times. So you can imagine how long it would take the government to investigate how far the money had moved in 24 hours. So indeed, some of the things that are happening with complicated corporate structures, one, they will use nominee shareholding. Mm-hmm. They will use shell companies, a company that is established, just that purpose, move the money in 24 hours, and in 24 hours, that company is totally useless. Number 2, they will use secrecy jurisdictions. And therefore, when you try to look for information relating to a company, you're almost floating in the air. We once did an analysis on behalf of one of the investigation units here in Kenya of a company and how many subsidiaries it had established for purposes of one transaction with government. They had established 17 subsidiaries in 8 tax havens, and the corporate service provider who offers that service is actually based out of Westlands in Nairobi. So the information is here. They know how to do it. It is not something that can be taught, because investment advisors, they will always try to stay ahead of government. Mm. They will always try to beat the system. So they will use the easiest loophole. The easiest loophole, like if you can use your grandmother's ID to set up a company, they will do that. And then use that company to move millions, and overnight that company is closed. So indeed, we call them complex because they use different approaches, secrecy jurisdictions, bearer shares, nominee shareholders, and within no time that company is just existing on paper and doing nothing. It's something that can be taught, and there's actually a civil society organization that is perfecting the art of mapping complicated corporate structures. So indeed, civil society is ahead of the curve. Mm.
Wow. Jared, I add what was asked by Monica. Do you think you can do that in a minute? Just straight away answer to Monica so that Leonard can conclude for us. We are really very pressed.
So I think, thank you. Maybe just to quickly answer that. Okay, the challenge is at what point do we get everybody to be on the table, probably when discussing. I think my quick answers could be, one, the challenge we have is the discretionary way of doing things, where we have, like you mentioned, the mining chambers sitting down to negotiate with extractive companies coming on board. They forget there are other agencies which need to look into this. So the answer could be having an interagency collaboration will help to minimize some of these things. Because if you have tax KRA on board, you have treasury on board, and you have the Ministry of Mining on board, each of these ministries has its objectives and agenda. So if you combine this, then you have like a very optimal way forward as regards to maybe concluding on a given contract.
Thank you.
And then another thing is probably the aspect of beneficial ownership, so that you can be able to establish who owns what and where. Then from there, whatever Frank is discussing can easily be connected, so that you can easily understand who is doing what and what business. I think that is what I can answer as regards to that.
Thank you very much. Robert Suna was agreeing with you vehemently, because last November we were in Kampala with the ETAF, the Africa Tax Administration Forum. And what played out clearly, Leonard, you remember, is that the revenue body, administration bodies' objectives are actually at conflict with the objectives of the treasuries. All right? The objectives of treasuries is to get many companies in so that they can probably create jobs and whatever it is. But the revenue administration bodies want tax. So treasury is giving tax holidays. The revenue administration bodies are trying to look for the tax. Same government, not speaking from the same script. So you can see that the Ministry of Mining is trying to issue licenses so that mining activity can be increased. Different objectives from the revenue administration body, different from the Ministry of the treasuries of countries. It is chaos, I can tell you that. So, Jared, thank you for that answer. And I think it puts this problem in perspective completely. I want us to conclude with Leonard. Then we agree on how to take about 10-15 minutes to do the last session. And we have really to thank you for the patience, for allowing us to go this far. Leonard.
Thank you very much, Cyprian. So essentially, the challenge here of IFFs is we know there is illegal money, and Francis Cairo has talked about that very clearly. But when dealing with this, there is the legal means by which money is being whisked away. We put it into the category of illicit financial flows because we see it now as an immorality. Of course, this is now textbook definitions and whatnot. But in the case of Kenya in particular, why, and I'll put this in terms of the second question about the judicial review. I'm not a lawyer, but just in terms of the context. Why we put in a petition is that, one, for instance, no one had sat around the table, as my sister had asked. Secondly, the speed of how money moves, as Alvin had stated in the morning, by the whim of an email, you move from the UK to Mauritius. Then you have no DTA policy from KRA. So as they negotiate, no minimums, no standards, especially standards of national interest, especially if you think that the national interest is domestic revenue mobilization. You don't have that, so your negotiators are not guided. And then lastly, no parliamentary involvement. So essentially, you're undermining the law of the land that actually protects you and actually guides you. So in that sense, then the petition makes a lot of sense in that it kind of technically gives the opportunity for a lot of other advocacy, public participation things, and so on and so forth. And you can clearly see that there is a change in policy behavior. Now the government has been asking, come and give us comments for Singapore. Come and give us comments for Barbados. That's one opportunity, but still we have to re-examine all the other treaties. We have 9 others that went through the same process.
You're concluding?
Yes, so with that, on the specific question by, I believe it was Kwesi Obeng on the ones there.
Yeah.
And it's tied again to what you're saying, the domestic law. So if we talk about-
And the sanctions.
And the sanctions. So if we talk about how is it happening? Again, if you look at the IFFs, we talk about the immorality and whatnot. But for instance, in Kenya, there is the legal and the security aspect. So for instance, monitoring terrorism financing, and this has informed a lot of the policy. So we find domestically, we are very strong on a law called Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering, where every $3,000 is monitored. And so that is guiding. And we know that, for instance, the corruption cases today are built based on that, and it's very, very strong. So essentially, we are saying, look, let's not lose confidence in the structure we have put up.
we don't need DTAs to always come about and create new tools for money to be whisked away. Not really a extractive case, but what has happened, and I'm glad Mary had mentioned it, the case of SportPesa is a classic example. You have 6 trillion just moved out of this country. Annually, they have 100 million turnover, I think, something like that. No questions asked, thanks to a DTA signed in 63. That should be up for review, right? So this is the environment that we are operating in. And if you consider the 48 treaties, then we definitely have to evaluate it.
Good. Let's appreciate everybody in that round.